a bold reformer at the top of the party, led the Eorts to restructure the economy to become more e-scient. This process was extremely controversial and hurt a lot of people who had benefited from the old system, so it took a lot of courage and intelligence, as well as support from the top, to execute. Best practices were used in Modi-ed for the Chinese environment. Xu became premier in 1998, and in that capacity continued to aggressively pursue reforms to modernize and make the Chinese economy more e-scient, until he retired in 2003. Many of his former aides are among China's senior economic policy makers today. In 1995, I sent my 11-year-old son Matt to China, where he lived with Madame Gu and her husband and attended what was then a poor local school. Matt had been to China with me many times since he was 3 years old, and had gotten to know Madame Gu well. He didn't speak the language, so he would have to learn through immersion, which he did. Though his school was poor, it had smart and caring teachers who provided the children with an excellent, complete education that included character development. Though Matt was deprived of some comforts he was used to, he was superbly educated, loved, and better developed than he would have been in our rich community. He built deep attachments with his teachers and friends that still exist. The experience led him to set up a foundation to help Chinese orphans that he ran for 12 years. Around that time I also hired a Chinese team to invest American institutional money in Chinese businesses. I pursued the Eort for a couple of years but had to discontinue it because I found it too difficult to run it and Bridgewater at the same time. In 1995-96 it became widely known that Deng's health was failing. Chinese leaders worried that his death would be viewed as an opportunity to challenge Chinese authority. They were especially worried that the Taiwanese would hold a referendum in favor of independence. President Lee Teng-hui, whom China regarded as a pro-independence leader, had just made a controversial visit to the U.S., shortly in advance of his nomination for Taiwan's 1996 presidential election. Madame Gu knew the Chinese official in charge of relations with Taiwan and arranged for me to meet with him. He told me that China would do anything, including going to war, to prevent Taiwanese independence. Should a new Chinese leader permit a referendum, he explained, the Chinese people would regard him as too weak to lead. China had seen how Russia's brutal suppression of rebels in the Chechen Republic had led to reduced support for independence. The Chinese hoped that a series of missile tests in the Taiwan Strait would similarly dampen Taiwan's enthusiasm. In March 1996, President Bill Clinton, who was facing re-election, sent 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait. Further military movements and threats on both sides followed. At the end of the day, the Taiwanese never held the referendum, so my Chinese friends thought their moves had been successful, while the Americans believed that they had humiliated the Chinese. As a result of the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, the Chinese significantly built up their military capabilities in the region. I point this out to convey A, how important Taiwan's reunification with China is, and B, how risky the situation was 25 years ago, when China was not nearly as strong militarily as it is now. In short, I would worry a lot if we were to see a fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. Deng died on February 19, 1997, having transformed China almost beyond recognition. When he came to power, 90% of the population lived in extreme poverty. At the time of his death, that number had fallen by more than half, and as of the most recent data is below 1%. From the start of his reforms in 1978 until his death in 1997, the Chinese economy grew at an average rate of 10% a year, sextupling in size while experiencing an average in Asian rate of just 8%. Its reserves grew from $4 billion to nearly $150 billion. Those reserves covered 60% of annual imports in 1978. By 1998, they covered more than 125% of imports. Deng's successors Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and their teams continued the reforms and the advances through many ups and downs. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis came along. With Xu Rongji assigned to run the Eort, China did a very successful debt and corporate restructuring, which included sales of unprofitable state-owned enterprises, the building up of exports and foreign exchange reserves, a crackdown on corruption, and the further development and improvement of markets and market functioning. These and other changes were all important evolutionary steps. I felt lucky to be intimately involved at the grassroots level with some of them, e.g., the debt restructuring and asset sales. Though these events seemed bigger at the time than they appear in retrospect, they were all significant achievements. I also ran into cases of corruption and bad behavior, and witnessed close up the ongoing struggle between the good and the bad that led to further reforms. As is typical of post-war periods of peace and prosperity, when the leading power isn't threatened and emerging countries aren't yet threatening, emerging countries can learn a lot from the leading powers as they work together in a symbiotic way, until the emerging power becomes powerful enough to threaten the leading power. In addition to benefiting from the learning, they benefit from trading with each other, and they benefit from using the capital markets to their mutual benefit. More specifically, the 1978-2008 period of fast growth in China came about because 1. The world was still in the peace and prosperity phase of the big cycle in which globalization and capitalism, i.e., the belief that goods and services should be produced wherever is most cost-effective, there should be free hours of talented people without prejudice toward their nationalities, nationalism is bad, and global equal opportunity and profit-seeking capitalism are good, were understood to be the widely accepted paths to a better world. While at the same time too, Deng Xiaoping swung the pendulum from communist and isolationist policies that worked terribly to market state capitalist and open-door policies that worked terribly. That led China to learn a lot, attract a lot of foreign capital, and become a giant exporter and big saver. As the Chinese became more capable of producing cost-effectively, they provided the world with inexpensive goods at RST and more advanced goods later, becoming much richer in the process. Other emerging countries did so as well, the world expanded, and the wealth gaps between the richest countries and the poorest countries narrowed as the poorest countries rose the most, while the richest countries grew at slower rates. These circumstances lifted most boats, especially the boats of the global elites. China rose to be a nearly comparable power to the United States, and together they created most of the world's new wealth and new technologies. Europe, which had been the source of the greatest global powers from the 15th to the 20th centuries, became relatively weak, and Japan and Russia became secondary powers. All other countries were peripheral. While emerging countries like India improved their conditions, none of them achieved world power status. Phase 3. The emergence of US-China conflicts and the end of globalization. As is classic, periods of prosperity enhanced by debt growth lead to debt bubbles and large wealth gaps. In the US, the bubble burst in 2008, and the world economy contracted and middle-class Americans and those in other countries were hurt. Interest rates were pushed down to 0%, which still wasn't enough easing, so central banks printed a lot of money and bought a lot of financial assets after 2008, which drove up their prices in most countries starting in 2009. This benefited the haves more than the have-nots, so the wealth gaps grew wider still, as they did in the 1933-38 period. The have-nots, especially those whose jobs were being taken by the Chinese and immigrants, began to rise up against the elites who were benefiting from globalization. As is typically the case when economic bad times coincide with large wealth gaps, populism and nationalism grew around the world. That is when the threat the rising powers pose becomes more apparent to the leading powers. The era of peace, prosperity, and globalization began to wane, giving way to an era of conflicts between the rich and the poor within countries and between the rising country and the dominant world power. The Chinese were holding a lot of US dollar-denominated debt, especially from US government agency lenders Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. For quite a while, the US government didn't let the Chinese holders of this debt know whether it would stand behind it. I had conversations with top Chinese holders of this debt, as did David McCormick and Hank Paulson. We were all impressed with the consideration and cooperation with which the Chinese approached the dilemma that the US had caused them. They were calm, empathetic, and cooperative. In November 2008, leaders of the G20 countries gathered in Washington, D.C., and agreed to jointly stimulate their economies through aggressive fiscal and monetary policies. These required a substantial increase of government debt, which was enhanced by having central banks create more money and credit. Debt growth in China was significantly faster than economic growth between 2009 and 2012 as a result of those policies. Becoming a world power. In 2012, Xi Jinping came to power and a new administration was chosen. Following the well-established sequence, RST Politburo members were chosen, then ministers, vice ministers, and their senior subordinates. Then the RST rounds of plans were made. As when most new leaders take power, there was a lot of excitement and an eagerness to strengthen both the rule of law by purging corruption and China's economy by strengthening and adding to its market-based reforms. There were a number of brainstorming sessions, and I was lucky enough to participate in a few. They were wonderful collaborations of people with different perspectives who wanted to help. The frankness, open-mindedness, friendliness, and intelligence that they brought to the table was remarkable. Since then, I have closely followed China's financial and economic circumstances and have had numerous conversations with its top economic policy makers about such matters as excessive debt growth, the development and management of their shadow banking system, the vulnerabilities in their financial systems, their trade disputes with the US, and more. I always tried to see things from their perspective and think about what I would do if I were in their shoes. I shared what I saw with them as frankly as a doctor discussing a medical case with colleagues, in much the same way as I am sharing it with you in this book. As you probably know by now, I believe that everything works like a machine, with timeless and universal cause-effect relationships. Chinese leaders do too, so we almost always came to similar conclusions. Over the years, the Xi administration has aggressively pursued policies to reform and open up its markets and its economy, manage its debt growth, more flexibly manage its currency, support entrepreneurship and market-oriented decision-making. Especially in industries that China wants to be world leaders in, establish sensible regulations run by well-developed regulatory organizations, build its capabilities in the technologies and industries of the future. Broaden the economic benefits extended to the people and regions that were lagging the most, and control pollution and environmental degradation. Yet many people don't see it that way, which I suspect is because A, the reforms are coming at the same time as other controls are tightening up. B, some of the supports for small and medium-sized organizations are not as good as they are for larger state-owned enterprises. C, the government directs the economy from the top down, sometimes expecting banks and companies to make uneconomic loans. D, China coordinates with its businesses in pursuit of national goals. E, it doesn't let some foreign companies operate on the same terms as Chinese companies. And F, it coordinates fiscal and monetary policy to regulate the economy much more than is done in the major reserve currency countries, all of which are typically unpopular with capitalist outsiders. Certainly many Americans are critical of these policies. While I won't delve into the merits of them, I will say that we should expect all countries' leaders to try to get the best balance between state and capitalism through the proper management and coordination of monetary and fiscal policies, and we should try to understand the thinking behind their approaches. For example, President Xi has said he wants to A, reduce the government's role in pricing and allocating resources, develop the capital markets, and stimulate entrepreneurship, while also B, strongly directing the macroeconomy and regulating markets and other aspects of life to be what he and the party believe are best for most Chinese. In other words, he wants a mix of capitalism and Marxist communism. This is understandably confusing to those who aren't used to seeing capitalism and communism go together, aren't watching closely, and haven't spoken with the policy makers to understand their circumstances and perspectives. So they can't see the consistencies that exist amid the seemingly great inconsistencies. To understand their circumstances and perspectives, I suggest that you not view what they are doing through stereotypes and accept that they are trying, and will continue to try, to juggle these two seemingly inconsistent things. In their view, capitalism is a way of raising the living standards of most people and is not meant to serve capitalists. Whether one thinks this approach is good or bad, their results have been extremely impressive, so we should not expect the Chinese to abandon it for an American or Western approach. Rather, we should study it to see what we can learn from it, the same way that the Chinese have studied and learned from the West. After all, what we have is a competition of approaches that we need to understand in order to play this competitive game well. As far as foreign policy is concerned, China has become stronger and more forceful while the United States has become more confrontational. More specifically, from 2012 until the time of my writing, China's strengths have grown, which has become increasingly apparent and more openly shown. This has sparked a strong reaction in the U.S., which became most evident after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Trump tapped into the resentments of those left behind by globalization, who believed that China was unfairly competing and stealing their jobs, and nurtured a new spirit of protectionism and nationalism. It wasn't just Trump. China's strength had become a provocation for more moderate policymakers as well. Where there had been synergy, there was now raw competition. Basically, China does not want to be contained and the United States want to contain it. What does that mean geopolitically? As you know by now, countries' boundaries have constantly changed over time, they are often in dispute, and international law isn't worth a hill of beans relative to power in resolving these disputes. In 2009, China declared to the United Nations that it has indisputable sovereignty over an area in the East and South China Seas. The area is marked by a 9-dash line on a World War II-era map presented by China. It covers offshore waters east of Vietnam, north of Malaysia, and west of the Philippines, which include a bunch of islands, are important for shipping that China needs, and are believed to have undiscovered oil reserves, which I imagine China would love to have given its huge imported oil needs and the risk of oil imports from the Middle East being cut off. If you read the World War II case study in Chapter 6 and saw how the U.S. cut oil resources to Japan, you know the issue. China has a great need for oil and other imports that currently come through a choke point at the Strait of Malacca. As a result of all of this and other assertions, the perception of China as a threat enemy has emerged, globalization has reversed, and wars have intensified, starting with the trade and economic wars, expanding to the technology and the geopolitical wars and, most recently, to the capital war. All remain relatively mild in relation to what they could be, but they should be watched closely. Eventually, the actual powers of a country that are recognized become consistent with the actual powers that exist. The actual powers that exist are reacted in the gauges and other facts that I'm watching for guidance. China has continued to grow internally and to expand its investment and business activities outside its borders. It has invested heavily in the developing world, most notably through the Belt and Road Initiative, which extends through Central Asia, starting with the countries on its border to Europe, and through the Arabian Peninsula and South Asia into the Mediterranean and Africa. The amounts invested and earmarked for investment are enormous, the largest such programs since the Marshall Plan. It is a good demonstration that wealth equals power. While these moves have been appreciated by the countries that received the BENATS from roads and other infrastructure, resources, and trade, they have also sparked resentments from recipient countries who are having problems paying back their loans and envy that China is too controlling. And from the United States because China's assertions of soft power have lessened American influence in those countries. As far as China's internal politics are concerned, in 2018 Xi consolidated power around himself and his supporters, amended the Chinese constitution to make it clear that the Chinese Communist Party has control over everything. C. Eliminated term limits for the president and vice president. D. Created supervisory commissions to ensure that government officials are operating consistently with the party's wishes. And E. Enshrined Xi's perspective, called Xi Jinping Thought, into the constitution. As of this writing, big political changes, increased controls, and wider distribution of wealth are all underway. Some people are concerned that Xi is becoming more autocratic than Mao. I'm no expert on Chinese politics, so I don't have much to owe when it comes to China's internal political matters, but I will pass along what I am told. Which is that Xi's controversial moves to tighten his control came about because of the belief that China is entering a more decouped phase in a more challenging world, and that at such times, unity and continuity of leadership are especially important, and that will be the case even more over the next few years. As mentioned earlier, periods of great crisis, more autocratic and less democratic leadership tends to be preferred. Then, in late 2019, The COVID-19 pandemic began in China, sparking a worldwide economic downturn in 2020, and the massive printing and creation of money and credit, which coincided with various types of conics in the US. That brings us up to today. Looking back over the last 4 decades, China's shift from isolation to opening up and from hardcore communism to market reforms and capitalism have had a greater impact on the economies of China, the US, and the rest of the world than anything else. China transitioned from one of the most backward countries in the world to one of the 2 most powerful economically, technologically, militarily, and geopolitically. Most of that progress occurred during an era of peace and prosperity, when the leading empire wasn't threatened and globalization and cooperation flourished. The period lasted until the bursting of the debt bubble in 2008, when the United States and much of the rest of the world became more nationalistic, protectionist, and confrontational, following the archetypical big cycle progression. The results of China's reform and opening up are re-acted in the following table, which shows just a few representative statistics. Output per person has increased 25 times, the percentage of people living below the poverty line has fallen from 96% to less than 1%, life expectancy has increased by an average of about 10 years, and the average number of years of education has increased by 80%. I could go on and on, rattling equally impressive statistics in virtually every area. China's development since 1949 and 1978. The World Bank only has poverty data back to 1981. While the indicators of China's rise are broadly representative, they aren't precise because the powers can't be precisely measured. Take education, for example. While our index for education rises at a fairly brisk pace, it fails to fully capture the relative improvements in China because it is made up of average as well as total levels of education. This distortion is best conveyed in the next table. As you can see, while the average education level in China is considerably below the average education level in the US, China's total number of people who have attained higher-level education is significantly greater than the United States. Its total number of STEM graduates is about 3 times the United States. At the same time, there are reasons to believe that the average quality of Chinese education isn't as high, especially at the college level. For example, in a recent ranking, only 2 Chinese universities appeared among the top 50 universities in the world while 30 American universities did. This picture, in which the average of something in China is below the average of the same thing in the United States, but the total in China is greater than the total in the US, is because the average level of development in China is lower while the Chinese population is more than 4 times as large as the American population. That comes across in a number of stats. For example, while the United States is militarily stronger in total all over the world, the Chinese appear to be militarily stronger in the East and South China Seas area, and there is a lot that is unknown about both countries' military powers because they are kept secret. United States. China. Average years of government spending on education, percent of S population W tertiary education. United States. China. Tertiary education. Tertiary education. STEM majors. In conclusion, this modern era for China has led to some of the most rapid improvements in basic living conditions in history as well as an obvious climb in the factors that create powerful empires. In all respects, China is now a major and expanding power. Next, we will turn to the US-China relationship in light of where it is now and what matters most to Americans and the Chinese. The entire report on China's dynasties is available at. Among the many inventions of the Song dynasty were the movable type printing press, a compass for navigation, and paper currency. China's share of world GDP rose to 30% and the population more than doubled during the 1700s. To clarify, most dynasties were minor, short-lived dynasties or regional dynasties that swiftly rose and fell during periods of instability in China. Diarent sources give Diarent numbers for the total number of dynasties because it's not even clear what constituted a minor or regional dynasty versus some other form of administration. Concerning the major dynasties, there were roughly 9 that uni-ed China and often ruled for extended periods. This group includes the VR case study focuses on from 600 to the present, and 4 from the 800 years prior. Typically, the bad emperors were distant from managing the affairs of the empire and tolerated, or even participated in, corruption while ignoring public investment needs. Several were known for greater ideological rigidity, for their poor judgment, and the poor judgment of their top advisors, and for being preoccupied with the luxuries that their positions afforded them. The last emperors of most dynasties often came after the dynasty was already weakened and often had limited control, or even involvement in political events. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'd like to thank Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia and current President and CEO of the Asia Society Policy Institute, for pointing me to these books and helping me understand Chinese politics. Because China's population is about 4 times as large as the US's, it only takes an income that is half as much per capita to have twice as much in total. There is nothing that I can see that stands in the way of China and the US having comparable per capita incomes over time, which would make China 4 times bigger. The Made in China 2025 plan is for China to be largely self-sufficient in most areas and to be world leaders in high-tech fields, including artificial intelligence, robotics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace. In March 2021, China released their 14th five-year plan and targets for 2035. If you haven't read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, I suggest you do to get the idea of what I am referring to. In his excellent book The Chinese World Order, Traditional China's Foreign Relations, the historian John Fairbank described China's relations with non-Chinese states as follows. The graded and concentric hierarchy of China's foreign relations included other peoples and countries which we may group into 3 main zones, RST, the Sinic Zone, consisting of the most nearby and culturally similar tributaries, Korea and Vietnam, parts of which had anciently been ruled within the Chinese Empire, and also Luciu Islands and, at brief times, Japan. Secondly, the Inner Asian Zone, consisting of tributary tribes and states of the nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples of Inner Asia who were not only ethnically and culturally non-Chinese but were also outside or on the fringes of the Chinese cultural area, even though sometimes pressing upon the Great Wall frontier. Third, the Outer Zone, consisting of the outer barbarians generally, at further distance over land or sea, including eventually Japan and other states of Southeast and South Asia and Europe that were supposed to send tribute when trading. I produced this diagram working with Professor Jiaming Zhu. These promissory notes were similar to what today would be called a bill of exchange. Earlier promissory notes were denominated in variable units, but eventually government-issued notes were in XCD denominations. The government OC issued these notes in exchange for cash coins. The devaluations in 1985, 86 and 1993 came after a period of opening up trade and an expansion in special economic zones. These openings created immense demand for foreign currency and imports to build production capacity, but it would still be a couple more years before those zones yielded much higher exports. That mismatch contributed to China's growing current account to CID. The massive Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest wars in human history, which led to an estimated 20-30 million killed, caused a giant-scale crisis that led to an issuance of debt that got monetized and led to high inflation. Ji Chaozhou was raised in the United States until he was a junior at Harvard. His brother was close to Zhou Enlai, who sent the brother and Ji Chaozhou to the United States to try to build good relations with Americans. When the Korean War broke out, he returned to China, became Zhou's interpreter, and later served in the RST Chinese delegation to the UN and as China's ambassador to England. While he told me a lot that I won't discuss to respect his privacy, I don't believe that this is sensitive information. I never ask questions that put them in the awkward position of having to choose between conveying confidential information and having to decline my request. I make it clear at all times that my sole desire is to understand and help. Chapter 13. U.S.-China Relations and Wars. In this chapter 1 we'll be looking at the positions that the U.S. and China now endy themselves in, and what being in these positions means for U.S.-China relations. Because the U.S. and China are now rival powers in a number of domains, they are in conflicts, or wars, in these domains, so I will be looking at where these stand. Because for the most part these are just new versions of old and classic conics, e.g., new technologies in a classic technology war, new weapons in a classic military war, etc. I will be putting them in the context of what has happened repeatedly in history and with the timeless and universal principles we have learned from studying these cases. While I will explore the range of possibilities that one might consider, I will be doing that without getting into what the future might look like. I will do that in the concluding chapter of this book. In this chapter 1 will also be moving a bit more from just conveying facts to sharing opinions. I am primarily focusing on US-China relations in this chapter, but in truth the game macro investors and global policy makers are playing is like multidimensional chess that requires each player to consider the many positions and possible moves of a number of key players that are also playing the game, with each of these players having a wide range of considerations that they have to weigh to make their moves well. The relevant other players that are now in this multidimensional game include Russia, Japan, India, other Asian countries, Australia, and European countries, and all of them have many considerations and constituents that will determine their moves. From playing the game I play, global macro investing, I know how complicated it is to simultaneously consider all that is relevant in order to make winning decisions. I also know that what I do is not as complicated as what those in the seats of power do, and I know that I don't have access to information that is as good as what they have, so it would be arrogant for me to think I know better than they do about what's going on and how to best handle it. For those reasons I am airing my views with humility. With that equivocation I will tell you how I see the US-China relationship and the world setting in light of these wars, and I will be brutally honest. The positions the Americans and Chinese are in. As I see it, destiny and the big cycle manifestations of it have put these two countries and their leaders in the positions they are now in. They led the United States to go through its mutually reinforcing big cycle successes, which led to excesses that led to weakening in a number of areas. Similarly, they led China to go through its big cycle declines, which led to intolerably bad conditions that led to revolutionary changes and to the mutually reinforcing upswings that China is now in. So, the United States appears to be in decline and China appears to be on the rise for all the classic reasons. Destiny and the big debt cycle led the US to end itself now in the late cycle phase of the long-term debt cycle in which it has too much debt and needs to rapidly produce much more debt, which it can't service with hard currency. So it has to monetize its debt in the classic late cycle way of printing money to fund the government's deficits. Ironically, and classically, being in this bad position is the consequence of the United States' successes leading to these excesses. For example, it is because of the United States' great global successes that the US dollar became the world's dominant reserve currency, which allowed Americans to borrow excessively from the rest of the world, which put the US in the tenuous position of owing other countries a lot of money, which has put those other countries in the tenuous position of holding the debt of an overly indebted country that is rapidly increasing and monetizing its debt, and that pays significantly negative real interest rates to those holding its debt. In other words, it is because of the classic reserve currency cycle that China wanted to save a lot in the world's reserve currency, which led it to lend so much to Americans who wanted to borrow so much, which has put the Chinese and the Americans in this awkward big debtor-creditor relationship when these wars are going on between them. Destiny and the way the wealth cycle works, especially under capitalism, led to incentives and resources being put into place that allowed Americans to make great advances and produce great wealth, and eventually created the large wealth gaps that are now causing conflicts and threatening the domestic order and productivity that is required for the US to stay strong. In China it was the classic collapse of its finances due to debt and money weaknesses, internal conflicts, and conflicts with foreign powers that led to its big cycle financial declines at the same time that the US was ascending. And it was the extremity of these terrible conditions that produced the revolutionary changes that eventually led to the creation of incentives and market capitalist approaches that produced China's great advances, great wealth, and the large wealth gaps that it is understandably increasingly concerned about. Similarly, destiny and the way the global power cycle works have now put the United States in the unfortunate position of having to choose between guiding to defend its position and its existing world order or retreating For example, it is because the United States won the war in the PCC in World War II that it, rather than any other country, will have to choose between defending Taiwan. Most Americans don't know where in the world it is or how to spell it, or retreating. It is because of that destiny and that global power cycle that the United States now has military bases in more than 70 countries in order to defend its world order, even though it is uneconomical to do so. History has shown that all countries' success depends on sustaining the strength and without producing the excesses that lead to countries' declines. The really successful countries have been able to do that in a big way for 200,300 years. No country has been able to do it forever. Thus far we've looked at the history of the last 500 years, focusing especially on the rise and decline cycles of the Dutch, British, and American reserve currency empires and at the last 1,400 years of China's dynasties, which has brought us up to the present. The goal has been to put where we are in the context of the big picture stories that got us here and to see the cause-effect patterns of how things work so that we can put where we are into better perspective. Now we need to drop down and look at where we are in more detail, hopefully without losing sight of that big picture. As we drop down, things that seem imperceptibly small in retrospect, Huawei, Hong Kong's sanctions, closing consulates, moving battleships, unprecedented monetary policies, political GHTS, social connects, and many others, will at the time appear much larger. And we will envy ourselves in the blizzard of them that comes at us every day. Each warrants more than a chapter-long examination, which I don't intend to do here, but I will touch on the major issues. History has taught us that there are major types of wars. 1. Trade economic wars. 2. Technology wars. 3. Geopolitical wars. 4. Capital wars. And 5. Military wars. To these I would add 6. Culture wars and 7. The war with ourselves. While all sensible people wish that these wars weren't occurring and instead that cooperation was happening, we must be practical in recognizing that they exist. We should use past cases in history and our understandings of actual developments as they are taking place to think about what is most likely to happen next and how to deal with it well. We see these wars transpiring in varying degrees now. They should not be mistaken for individual conflicts but rather recognized as interrelated conflicts that are extensions of one bigger evolving conflict. In watching them transpire we need to observe and try to understand each side's strategic goals, e.g., are they trying to hasten a conflict or are they trying to ease the conflicts? In order to prevent these conflicts from escalating out of control, it will be important for leaders of both countries to be clear about what the red lines and trip wires are that signal changes in the seriousness of the conflict. Let's now take a look at these wars with the lessons from history and the principles they provide in mind. The trade economic war. Like all wars, the trade war can go from being a polite dispute to being life-threatening, depending on how far the combatants want to take it. Thus far we haven't seen the US-China trade war taken very far. It features classic tariffs and import restrictions that are reminiscent of those we have repeatedly seen in other similar periods of conflict. We have seen the trade negotiations and what they achieved reacted in a very limited, Phase 1, trade agreement from 2019 that was tentatively implemented. As we have seen, this negotiation was about testing each other's powers rather than looking to global laws and judges to achieve fair resolution. Tests of power are how all these wars will be fought. The big question is how far these tests of power will go, and what form will they take. Beyond the trade dispute there are three major economic criticisms the US has about China's handling of its economy. 1. The Chinese government pursues a wide range of evolving interventionist policies and practices aimed at limiting market access for imported goods, services, and businesses, thus protecting its domestic industries by creating unfair practices. 2. The Chinese owe significant government guidance, resources, and regulatory support to Chinese industries, most notably including policies designed to extract advanced technologies from foreign companies, particularly in sensitive sectors. 3. The Chinese are stealing intellectual property, with some of this stealing believed to be state-sponsored and some of it believed to be outside the government's direct control. Generally speaking, the United States has responded both by trying to alter what the Chinese are doing and by doing its own versions of these things. Americans won't admit to doing some of the things they are doing any more than the Chinese will admit to doing them because the public relations costs of admitting to doing them are too great. When they are looking for supporters of their causes, all leaders want to appear to be the leaders of the army that is guiding for good against the evil army that is doing bad things. That is why we hear accusations from both sides that the other is doing evil things and no disclosures of the similar things that they are doing. When things are going well, it is easy to keep the moral high ground. However, when the fighting gets tough, it becomes easier to justify doing that which was previously considered immoral. As the guiding becomes tougher, a dichotomy emerges between the idealistic descriptions of what is being done and the practical things that are being done to win. That is because in wars leaders want to convince their constituents that we are good and they are evil, because that is the most effective way to rally people's support, in some cases to the point that they are willing to kill or die for the cause. Though true, it is not easy to inspire people if a practical leader explains that there are no laws in war, other than the ethical laws people impose on themselves, and we have to play by the same rules they play by, or we will stupidly GHT by self-imposing that we do it with one hand behind our backs. I believe that we have pretty much seen the best trade agreement that we are going to see, and that the risks of this war worsening are greater than the likelihood that they will lessen, and that we won't see any treaty or tariff changes anytime soon from the Biden administration. Whatever approach they eventually take will be a big influence on how Americans and the Chinese approach the big cycle destinies that are in the process of unfolding. As it now stands, the one thing, maybe the only thing, that both U.S. political parties agree on is being hawkish on China. How hawkish and how exactly that hawkishness is expressed and reacted to by the Chinese are now unknown. How could this war worsen? Classically, the most dangerous part of the trade economic war comes when countries cut others off from essential imports. The case study of the US and Japan leading up to World War II is a useful analog to US-China circumstances because the geographies and the issues are analogous. For example, the US cutting out China's imports of oil, other needed commodities, technologies, and/or other essential imports from the US or other countries would be clear and obvious signs of the war escalating. Likewise, China could escalate by cutting out companies like General Motors and Apple, or cutting out US imports of rare earth elements that are needed for the production of lots of high-tech items, automobile engines, and defense systems. I'm not saying such moves are likely, but I do want to be clear that moves to cut out essential imports from either side would signal a major escalation that could lead to a much worse conflict. If that doesn't happen, evolution will take its normal course, so international balances of payments will evolve primarily based on each country's evolving competitiveness. For these reasons, both countries, especially China, are shifting to more domestic production and decoupling. As President Xi has said, the world is undergoing changes not seen in a century, and in the face of